chilling quiet settled over the chaotic street. All anyone could hear was the frantic, muffled sounds of a young female police officer struggling. Her face was pressed against the dirty asphalt, her breath stolen by the weight on her back. Just a few feet away, a homeless man, a figure often overlooked, was watching. He saw what the others missed, a silent detail that told him everything. A glint of metal, a flicker of warning, and the cold truth that this woman's life was about to end unless anyone did something. He sat on a cold bench, the day's late afternoon sun a dull orange haze against the dusty glass of the storefront. The air carried the faint, mixed sense of hot asphalt, diesel fumes, and the sweet promise of a rainstorm that wouldn't come. Most people walked past him, their gazes sliding away as if he were just part of the scenery, a statue of forgotten dignity. He was a man with a story etched into his face, a map of battles and losses, each wrinkle a line of a journey no one bothered to read. He was a veteran, though no one would know it by the torn, faded jacket he wore. His name was Arthur. A commotion began to stir down the street. A young police officer, a woman with a braid the color of straw, was struggling to control a large, agitated man. She was clearly outnumbered and outmatched. He was shouting, his words a venomous spray of threats and curses. The officer, her face a mask of trained calm, tried to de-escalate, her voice a low, steady hum against his fury. Arthur didn't move. He simply watched, his gaze fixed not on the shouting man, but on the officer's hands. He saw the subtle strain in her wrists as she held the man at a distance, the quiet way she moved, like a dancer in a storm. He understood the language of her movements, the silent struggle to maintain control, the unspoken plea for the chaos to just stop. A crowd had started to gather, their cell phones raised like small, bright shields. They were not there to help. They were there to record, to witness, to spectate. The light of their screens illuminated their faces, a collection of detached, curious expressions. No one stepped forward. No one even called out. The silent complicity of the crowd was a heavy blanket, muffling the officer's quiet struggle. The man lunged, a sudden, violent movement. He shoved the officer and she stumbled back, her helmet hitting the pavement with a sharp, hollow sound. A gasp went through the crowd. Her radio fell from her belt, and she was down. The man stood over her, his shadow a dark, towering threat. Arthur's heart hammered a drumbeat he hadn't heard in years. It was the same rhythm of a firefight, a silent countdown to a moment of irreversible harm. He remembered a time when he was on his back, the sky a dizzying blur of smoke and stars. The dust of a faraway desert had coated his lungs. He remembered the weight of his gear, the sharp metallic smell of spent ammunition. He remembered Sergeant Williams's hand on his shoulder, the heavy pressure that grounded him, a silent promise of solidarity. Arthur had been just a boy, a young soldier scared and alone, and the sergeant had been a pillar of strength, a mountain that wouldn't move. But Sergeant Williams was gone. He'd gone down in a cloud of dust and fire, a selfless shield. Arthur had been a medic then, just a kid with a kit of bandages and a heart full of fear. He'd tried, his fingers fumbling with the torn fabric of the sergeant's uniform, his mind screaming, but there was nothing he could do. The sergeant had just smiled, a thin, brave line against the blood on his lips. "Don't talk," he had said, his voice a broken whisper. "Just listen. Listen for the quiet." And then he was gone, and Arthur was left with the silence, a deafening, heavy silence that had followed him for years, through the long journey home, through the loss of his family, through the slow slide into the anonymous life of the streets. The silence had become his power, the world's quiet way of telling him that no one was listening. So he had to. He had to watch and he had to wait. The man over the officer was still shouting. The officer, on her back now, had her hand up, a small, futile barrier against his anger. The crowd drew in a collective breath, their phones still held high. They were waiting for a climax, for a moment of televised violence. But Arthur wasn't looking at the man's fists. He was looking at his shoes, at the way the man's foot was planted, at the subtle shift in his weight. He saw it then. It was a faint, almost invisible detail, a small, subtle curve on the man's jacket just below his armpit. the telltale shape of a concealed object. It was a knife or something worse. Arthur's entire body went cold. The man was not just angry, he was dangerous. He was a threat that no one else had seen. Arthur began to walk. It was a slow, deliberate shuffle, a pace so quiet and unobtrusive that no one noticed him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't shouting. He was just a ghost moving through the living. He walked toward the man, his eyes locked on that small bulge under the jacket. He thought of Sergeant Williams, of his silent strength, of his last words. Just listen for the quiet. The loudest things were not the shouts or the sirens. The loudest things were the tiny unsaid warnings. The quiet curve of a hidden blade, the silent fear in a young officer's eyes. He was now just a few feet away. The man raised his fist, and the crowd gasped, a wave of motion rippling through them. But Arthur was not looking at the fist. He was looking at the knife, at the way the man's hand was moving to draw it. He knew the man's plan. This wasn't about a shove or a street fight. It was about a hidden, final act of violence. Arthur reached into his own coat pocket, his hand closing around a small, smooth rock he had been carrying. It was heavy, a perfect weight. He had carried it for years, a relic from a stream he'd played in as a boy. A piece of home. The man's fingers brushed against the handle of the knife. He was a millisecond away from pulling it out. Arthur, in that moment, did not shout. He did not yell. He simply said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, just loud enough for the officer to hear. He said, "Don't talk. Look at his other hand." The officer's eyes, trained to find trouble, instantly shifted. She saw the bulge, the motion, the impending danger that the rest of the world had missed. In an instant, her training kicked in. She rolled, her body a coiled spring of motion, and her foot shot out, catching the man just above the knee. The man cried out in surprise and pain, his balance broken. He fell forward, and the knife, just barely drawn, slid out of his hand and clattered on the ground. The officer was on her feet in an instant, her arm twisting behind his back, the handcuffs snapping shut with a cold, metallic click. The crowd was silent. They were looking at the man on the ground, then at the officer, then at the small, torn figure of Arthur, who was just walking away. The officer, her chest still heaving, her eyes wide with a quiet, shocked realization, and looked at the man on the bench. He was walking away, his back to her, a silent, unassuming hero. "Wait," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "How?" Arthur didn't turn around. He just kept walking. The officer, now standing over the handcuffed man, saw a different story in Arthur's posture. She saw the straightness of his back, the familiar, military-like way he held his head. She saw in the quiet dignity of his retreat a man who had seen more than she could ever imagine. And she understood. He didn't want thanks. He didn't want praise. He just wanted to walk away. The crowd began to buzz, a wave of confusion and belated appreciation. A few people began to clap, a scattered, awkward sound. But a young man in the crowd, one of the onlookers, walked over to where the knife lay. He picked it up, a look of shocked understanding on his face. He held it up to the crowd, and the low murmurs turned to gasps. He then turned, and with a quiet reverence, placed the knife on the bench where Arthur had been sitting. The officer looked at the silent crowd, at the still shocked faces. She looked at the knife, a symbol of the danger they had all missed. And she looked at Arthur, a small, unassuming figure walking away, back into the quiet anonymity of the street. She had learned a lesson that day. She had learned that the loudest voices were often the least important. The true stories were whispered, not shouted. She had learned that a hero did not always wear a badge, and sometimes the greatest strength was not a shout, but a whisper, a silent gesture, a profound, unsaid truth. The street began to feel different. The air was no longer thick with chaos, but with a palpable sense of quiet respect. The people, their phones now lowered, watched Arthur disappear around the corner. They had witnessed not a brawl, but a rescue, a moment of true heroism that had happened in the space between the noise, a moment that was defined by a single powerful command: don't talk. It was a reminder that some battles are fought in silence, and some heroes, the most profound ones, are those who listen for the quiet, who see the things no one else does, and who ask for nothing in return. And so Arthur walked on, his steps a silent, rhythmic beat against the pavement. He was just a man on a street, but for one fleeting, powerful moment, he had been a beacon of unseen strength. His story, etched into the lines on his face and the quiet dignity of his movements, was a testament to the fact that we should always look closer. We should listen not for the noise, but for the profound, meaningful quiet. I hope you enjoyed this script. If you would like to explore another story or a different kind of plot, please let me know. What kind of hero would you like to see next?